I don't think that it's a mass firings happening next week. It's more incremental productivity boosts happening over the next 6, 12, 24 months. And then over time, you decide whether you take those productivity gains and you turn them into fewer employees versus more productively deployed employees.
Christian, I am so excited for this. I've heard so many good things. So I would love to start with your entry into product. How did you come to be SVP of Product at Snowflake? Let's start there, Christian.
Thank you for having me, Harry. Background, born and raised in Colombia and South America. I did a startup there. I learned what not to do. I did another startup in the US. I learned what else not to do. So at some point, I need to learn from the guys that really know how to build software. This is 1999. I joined Microsoft, did a long stint in data all the time. SQL Server, appliances when appliances were the thing to build, and then cloud services. And from then I went over to YouTube at Google, where I was responsible for the infrastructure, including data systems. And I think all of that set me up for understanding data, being a data junkie. And when the opportunity opened up for Snowflake, I'm like, I could appreciate the technology and the type of company. So I'm like, I'm ready to be there.
It was the charm and charisma of Frank. I don't blame you. I had the same feeling when he looked into my eyes. I do have to ask, you mentioned that you learned what not to do. If there were one or two things that you really learned what not to do, what would they be, Christian?
I would say talent being the driver of truly great outcomes. I would say don't ever compromise on talent. Don't ever say, yeah, this person doesn't have the background, but maybe has the right intention. Just take a bet. No, I think that nothing substitutes talent. That's a very clear lesson learned. And the other thing that has been very clear is building a scalable business is difficult. Well, one of those startups, we built some scheduling software for airlines. And the thesis was you build it once, works, then you just resell it, and you can be the next Microsoft. It was not the case. There was a lot of customization. It would turn out into more of a services business. So scalability and building platforms was another lesson learned.
If that's the lessons learned from, respectfully, the startups that maybe didn't go to plan, we could say, when you think about Google and Microsoft, they're such symbolic institutions in our environment. What are 1 to 2 of your biggest takeaways from 13 years at Microsoft? I mean, shit, it's a long time. Yep. And then, the 4 to 5 years that you had at Google. What are 1 or 2 of those big takeaways?
Yeah, from Microsoft, I think I got the ease of use and value of simplicity in products. At the time, SQL Server was coming from way behind, competing with market leaders that were at Oracle and IBM. And the way in was not to have every single feature and capability that those technologies had. It was just simplify things. If you turn something that is a subset of the capability, but dramatically easier to use, that gets a following. And that was a very, very clear lesson learned. And I've seen it over and over. And by the way, the Snowflake story follows a big part of that journey, which is if you simplify things to a point that it is delightful to use, people adopt. That's from the Microsoft time. Let me think. From the YouTube time, maybe the biggest lesson learned is that consumer products have many more elements beyond just technical difficulty. There's a lot of timing. What are the trends with consumer behavior? Sure, you need to have a good business model. You need to have good technology, but there are things that you can't control.
Can I ask you a really hard one? Is simple always better in product?
I would say yes. Well, you'll say all things being equal, there are points where you will oversimplify, but I do think that make things as simple as possible and no more.
If you could call yourself up the night before your first role in product, before Microsoft, before Google, what would you call yourself up and advise yourself, knowing all that you know now?
The fundamentals of making something work as advertised make a very big difference. So simplicity is part of it. Quality is a big part of it. Even things like latency make a big difference. So there's nothing like the magical experience of you try to use a product and then whatever technology or a device or an appliance at home. And if it just simply works and does what it's expected, I think that is a magical thing. It's very hard to make happen in all situations, but that would be the big word of advice.
Now, I do want to focus the show on a joint passion for both of us. It's funny, we discussed a little bit in terms of topics to discuss today, and I was very excited when I got your suggestions. And I want to start from the top, which is kind of ecosystem level, and then we'll move down. But as generative AI is kind of the biggest buzzword of today, VCs...
Never heard of it.
Never heard. What is this? So when we think about Gen AI as a buzzword, like top down, how do you analyze the ecosystem today? Is the hype overblown as a starting point?
Yeah, I would say that for sure there is hype. For sure there's a FOMO on what are you doing on Gen AI, and people are rushing to somehow stitch some Gen AI to their products. But if you look past that, there is fundamental innovation there. There is fundamental disruption. I do think that there is the opportunity to change pretty much every single interaction between humans and computers into something that is friendlier and simpler. So yes, there's fog and there's noise around it, but it will clear up, and at the end of the day, it's going to be a different world.
Do you think mobile is a good analogy to AI, or do you think it's actually more significant?
I think it's comparable. I think it's of the scale of the internet. I think it's of the scale of mobile. One of those things where anything and everything will get better.
Can I ask, what do you think is most exciting when you look at the different verticals, use cases, opportunities? What do you think is most exciting?
I would say that this is a real shot in the arm to the creative businesses. And that's, I think, where we talked about generative AI, that it's generating or creating something. That's where we saw the initial use cases and stable diffusion or Midjourney and those things. In many ways, because what in other industries we would call a bug or a hallucination, in the creative world, there are features. It's a goodness to come up with something that has not been done before, or it's a mix and match of existing things. So creative industries are probably the sweetest spot. I love what Adobe has been doing with their products and how they've integrated Gen AI. Massive kudos to them. Then there's the opportunity in every other industry, in every other vertical. It's only that requires a little bit of understanding correctness, understanding data maturity, things like that. But every customer that I talk to these days, they're looking into doing something. They're all trying to figure out how to get started and how to get there. But I think it applies to all sorts of businesses.
It's interesting you said there about kind of they're all looking to do something. You know what I'm finding though? Because I speak to these enterprises too. They've got no freaking clue how to do it, Christian. They're all like, yeah, so it's exciting. How do I do that, Harry? And I think the biggest businesses in AI will be built in the implementation services businesses, helping large enterprises implement AI in a meaningful way into their enterprise over the next decade. Do you agree with me in terms of this lack of enterprise education on implementation and the potential opportunity for implementation services given that?
I agree. Part of it is services, implementation, education. But I also think that the stack and the way to think about this is evolving. I don't think that we have a very clean, this is the 3 or 4 components that you use, and this is the type of use case that you apply. Companies are playing with, hey, the LLM is magical, and you send it to questions and magic answers come back. Some others have combined vector retrieval with LLMs. But within that, there's a lot of variability. Which model, which database, or which vector database, how much do you prompt versus fine-tune? So I would say a lot of that is still being figured out. And I think the stack continues to evolve, will continue to mature. And in parallel, okay, then companies need to get educated on when to use what for what use case.
I get you. In terms of kind of like verticals that are fastest to adopt, I think this is the other thing that we all get a little bit overexcited about, which is like speed of adoption always takes longer than people think. Many, if you can believe it, Christian, enterprises in Europe still have no idea what Slack is. And so my question to you is, when we think about the different verticals, who do you think is first to adopt and the fast movers? Who do you think is slow to adopt?
I think it completely correlates with data maturity. You may have heard some of us at Snowflake talk about there's no AI or Gen AI strategy without a data strategy. It's not just a line. It's a truth that we strongly believe in. And from that perspective, I would say financial services are at the forefront. Most of the financials have figured out for a long time how to organize data and leverage data for competitive advantages. Go look at the sophistication of hedge funds as an example. Retail and CPG companies have also been very wise at using data. Maybe I would point at public sector. Not that they're not data savvy, but they have a lot of regulation and constraints that may make it harder for them to adopt.
How do you think about incentives being a problem? And my point here is, like, if you think about healthcare is largely dictated by, government budgets, by the NHS in the UK or, the alternative in the US, which is run by politicians. You don't want to replace nurses with AI-driven robots, procedures, because then you'd be firing nurses. And then the front page of the newspaper is Biden or Rishi Sunak fires nurses. So the incentive mechanism is misaligned to increasing efficiency in healthcare or in a lot of public services because it likely leads to job loss. How do you think about the incentive function being the problem for adoption versus implementation speed?
I think it may be true that once we're ready to wholly replace nurses and other functions, probably there's an incentive problem. But I don't think that we're there yet. I think of most of the use cases right now are around productivity boost or assistance, co-pilots, as opposed to replacement. So think of it as, I want to help people be more productive, not wholesale replace. So at this point, I would say the incentives should be working. Maybe, I don't know, a couple of years from now, what you're saying becomes true.
You said there about there's no Gen AI without being kind of an incredible data strategy. You said to me before, generative AI is democratizing data access. You left me with that as a cliffhanger, Christian. So how so, and why do you believe this?
Yeah, if you think of the role of traditional business intelligence technology, was to sort of bridge the impedance mismatch between the business and business terminology and business users, a technology that frankly is just for a few people. Like writing SQL statements is not something that most people in a company do. And that was the role of that technology to do that translation, but it still required some mapping and curation and effectively how do you inform that impedance mismatch. I think Gen AI has the opportunity to turbocharge this type of translation where the language is natural language and the answers come in natural language, but along the way, there's traditional database lookups, traditional retrieval. And it has the opportunity to democratize data dramatically more than where we are today. And not that BI has not done a really good job, but I think it's going to be now data for everyone.
When we think about kind of data as a competitive moat, I've had a lot of people on the show say before, bluntly, that data is so freely accessible today. It's no longer this prized possession that incumbents can hail and use to their advantage, given how freely accessible it is. To what extent do you still place a premium on data ownership to leverage versus the freedom to access data?
Yeah, I would separate there's both public data and private data, privately owned by enterprises. But the premise of your question is based on public data. And I would say, if things did not change, the language models or the models in general would all converge towards they're all training on the same data. And at some point, this what mix of data you use, but you'll trend towards the same answer. The interesting trend to what's there is the notion of many companies realizing that their data is being used and monetized by these models. So there are companies rethinking and changing their data policies. Are you allowed to crawl me? Are you allowed to train models with this? I think all of this will shift in the next 6-12 months. This is all starting already, because in the same way that search changed the rules of engagement with public data, Gen AI is doing the same thing, and the companies that are behind the data are doing so.
You've left me on a very big statement there, which is like you mentioned there, companies realizing that their data is being used bluntly and they're not being able to monetize it and they're losing eyeballs because of it on their sites. How do you think about the business model of the future to ensure that they don't lose this revenue despite their loss of data control?
I don't know if they're going to be able to keep all the existing revenue, but for sure they should be able to capture some amount of revenue. So I don't know exactly what would be the replacement ratios, but clearly their data is valuable. Right now it's not being paid for, and that says that there's a value gap there. And you see it in some of the license terms that are being floated around. I think it will shift. So then it changes the economics of all of this.
Can I ask, if you were to place a value on data versus model, what would you place? 100 is your total pie size. Is it 80-20? Is it 50-50? How do you weigh the importance in terms of data and model?
The vast majority goes to data. I don't know if it's 90+%. Certainly there's a lot of IP and technology that has gone into how do you build these models? But that is becoming less the differentiating aspect, and what's becoming bigger is data. If anything, you hear folks doing the math on, are we going to run out of public data to improve these models significantly? So I would say
I'm sorry,
data takes the edge.
I would just love your advice. Why are models as little as 10? And bluntly, why is such value being placed on the likes of OpenAI, Bard, Anthropic, if actually models are 10 and not a significant chunk more?
Well, I would say if you look at it where things are today or where they were 6 months ago, maybe models would have taken a bigger edge because they paved the way on how do you model the data. You could make the case data has been there all along, but I would stick to the 10% or the smaller number, because now you see how many foundation models are being created. We've seen companies that with 7 employees have creating models that are comparable for some use cases to what OpenAI or Anthropic do. So I would say at the end of the day, it's a data problem. And model, these are strong words, but I think they're getting commoditized until the next big innovation comes and you allocate some more value to the model.
Can I ask, what's the next big innovation, do you think? Sorry, I'm really freewheeling here. I'm just learning in real time.
I'm hearing, I'm largely repeating, what has happened for language models is coming for computer vision, for images. The democratization, how do you simplify it? Then there's the intersection of those true multimodal languages, which there are many of them out there, but how do you turn it into, it's completely seamless to go and intersect images, speech, text, all of it into a richer human-computer interface.
Do you think it is the existing kind of model incumbents, your OpenAIs, your Anthropics of the world, who chase down those innovations, or do you think it's net new platforms?
I have no idea. I'm pretty sure all of them are chasing that. I don't know for a fact, but I'm willing to venture that they're definitely chasing those innovations. But I also, what we're seeing right now has generated such a big spur of creativity. Most new startups getting created, somehow they all want to chase some aspect of the Gen AI revolution. So maybe it's a hybrid of both. I don't think anyone knows how all of this plays out, even 12 months from now.
You mentioned their startups chasing it. So many VCs say, you know what? They're just a wrapper on top of a GPT model, like, and it's kind of brushed off in that way. It's just a GPT wrapper. Do you think that's fair? And actually these models and the providers will create and kill off all the startups with their verticalized use cases? Or do you actually think that VCs are being short-sighted with the kind of handoff of it's just a wrapper?
I think there's many categories. There are some very shallow wrappers on top of GPT-4. I don't place much value on them. I usually ask, hey, how long did it take you to build this? Oftentimes it's a week or two. I don't think there's a company there. I do think that there are some very deep wrappers on top of GPT-4 that apply domain-specific, legal, or other domain that I think you end up with a true way to bring GPT-4 to a given market or industry. I think those are value. There are actually many startups chasing the different aspects of innovation on the core technology. I was at a dinner a few weeks ago and someone was saying, we're trying to blend fine-tuning with prompting. Someone else was saying, we're trying to address the limitations of the transformer model. Someone else was trying to look at how to do computer vision better. Once you start looking at the core tech, not just application of existing models, I think there's innovation everywhere, which is why I would say there will be a number of new startups creating new things, and probably the OpenAIs and Anthropics are continuing their innovation, which those are effectively research companies.
They absolutely are in many ways research companies. The thing I want to ask is, like, often the size of the model is quite hailed. How important do you think model size is today, Christian?
I think it depends on the use case. For a generic consumer product like ChatGPT, where anything is fair game, the model is supposed to know about every possible topic, it speaks every language, etc., I would say that for those use cases, a model that is large and has lots of cumulative knowledge is very valuable. I would say that for specialized use cases, which is what I see more in the enterprise, model matters less. If anything, model size will influence things like cost and latency. So smaller may be better. And now there's plenty of examples that have been run where a smaller model fine-tuned for a specific purpose or a specific data set produces results better than a generic model. So I would say it's use case dependent.
Do you think we actually do that? We downsize model size to increase efficiency, to reduce latency, to reduce cost? Or do you think we actually just increase efficiency of compute to be able to ingest and work with larger model sizes more efficiently?
Both. And as I was mentioning startups, one of the companies that I talked to was working entirely on model compression, only to improve latency and cost. So I think there's research and development on both. Sure, the compute is getting faster and cheaper, but smaller models are better. Like if you want to have one or more model calls in the serving path of a consumer product, you have a budget of a few milliseconds to go make things happen, and size will matter.
It's interesting there, kind of thinking about kind of the efficiency, the cost, the latency. I had Nom from Character on the show, and he said the biggest problem that we have is the cost of training. It was like $2 million to train one single model. How do we think about the cost of training changing over time? Will we see a democratization there, which will allow startups to fine-tune and train themselves? Will it continue to be high? Help me understand that.
For sure, like all of this, the compute is trending down. But the other piece is there's a lot of reinvention of the core training. If you think about how many of the data sets and data sources are common between all the foundation models out there, and they're going through the exact same processes or very similar processes, are there ways to take a common subset and then you just fine-tune on top of it and avoid the cost? I think we've seen reasonably good results under that path. So I do think that both approach-wise and compute cost-wise, cost of training is going to get lower.
Okay, so cost of training gets lower. There's also another thing, which is like the longevity of models. I had one guest email at Stability, and he said that no models we use today will be used in a year. Do you think that's true?
Depends on how you define a model. If you say Llama and Llama 2 are the same model or the model family, then yes, all of them will continue to be used for a while. If you pin a specific version, then yeah, for sure there will be new versions of any of those models, Claude 2, etc. So depending on the definition of a model or a model hierarchy, I would say things are going to change or things are going to be stable. But the reality is there will be new models and new refinements on an ongoing basis.
I agree with you there. Can I ask, when we think about kind of those refinements, companies that are able to transition between models obviously have the most flexibility. I think it was Alex at Nabla, another incredible founder we had on the show. He said the best companies will be able to transition between models at ease, and those that can will win. Do you think that's right in terms of the importance of flexibility to transition between models being a core determinant of success?
100% agree. I don't know if that's what determines who wins, but I do think that there's so much innovation in the landscape of models that anyone that builds too tightly coupled to a given model is sort of giving up optionality for the future. I just came back from Japan 2 days ago, and a big recommendation I was doing in a large forum was make sure that you build optionality into which model you're leveraging. Even though it's easier to learn the ins and outs of a single model, I think the optionality matters, especially there's way too much change and innovation going on.
Can I ask you, what does it mean to make sure you have optionality? What do you do differently if you're thinking with optionality in mind?
Well, you'd want to be able to plug in different models, but it's not just replace the model and use everything else the same. Certain models respond different to a specific type of prompt. So at some point, you need to have in the same way that you have a hardware abstraction layer or a cloud abstraction layer, you should have a model abstraction layer that knows how to translate a specific request that your application needs to do to a model with its intricacies or specific characteristics.
I totally get you there. Can I ask, in terms of the transition between models, implementation is not that easy. You're not just handing over data with ease. What are the biggest challenges to adoption, do you think, for startups and for companies moving forwards when they think about working with new models and kind of data migration to them?
There are a lot of issues. Probably the most obvious one is around the correctness and dependability of answers. If you ask folks, one of the key concerns is well, these models make up stuff. So that is the obvious one. But then there are second order issues, important but maybe less obvious for people, which is security and privacy of data, the data that is used for the question. And then there are even more complex questions on the rights to the answers. A Wall Street company asked me, if we feed a number of portfolio trading strategies into a model and it makes a recommendation and the recommendation makes money, could anyone have claims on that answer? And it gets very complicated very quickly.
Okay, sorry. I'm writing down notes on my hand. That was great. How do we solve the security side? I totally get you. You've got customer data, you've got transaction data, but you do want access to the LLMs. What do enterprises do to get the benefits of access to them without the security issues that come with just sending thousands of customers' data?
I would say what you're seeing, many of us, so Snowflake for sure on the list, is evolve their platforms where it's easy to bring LLMs to the data as opposed to send large data volumes to where the LLMs are. That's where you see Amazon has new services to do this. Microsoft obviously has it with Azure OpenAI. The trend is create private and secure endpoints that can run close to your data, and by implication, not only don't have to move and copy a lot of data, but more important, there are some assurances on what is done with your data.
Okay, so we bring them closer in terms of the endpoints. In terms of you mentioned the hedge funds there and the right to the answer, and whether it's proprietary or whether it's spread across the 10 hedge funds that also wanted that information. How do you think that plays out? Does anyone have rights? Do you buy rights to answers? Talk to me about that.
It is complex. I don't know how it plays out. I do think that some of these statements about public web data owners changing licenses or potentially licensing the data gives one path forward. There's been interesting developments in the last week or so. Microsoft saying that they'll stand by customers from a copyright perspective. That was meaningful. There was another one from IBM.
Can I ask, why is that meaningful? For people listening, why is that meaningful that Microsoft will stand by customers for copyright data?
Because enterprises are worried about if they incorporate Gen AI into any of their products or services in a way that they truly depend on them. And at some point, lawsuits start to fly, they're exposed. And because of those concerns, it has held back enterprises. So Microsoft's statement is I would say, material in alleviating those concerns that are very real. I talk to people every week, and those are real concerns.
Do you think they will set a precedent now, which for the next year or two, while there is ambiguity in confidence from enterprises, that actually these large providers must provide a backstop to their enterprise customers to allow them to onboard with confidence?
I think it alleviates a faction of customers and a category of concerns. I don't think it takes care of all of it. There are opinions out there on does copyright law even apply to Gen AI? And it's a fascinating debate. Like, I'm not deep enough legally to make that type of assertion, but I've heard the debate and it makes sense. So I don't know how it plays out, but I think the standing by folks from a copyright perspective is a step forward.
Can I ask, are there any other big regulatory intricacies or challenges that you think not enough people are paying attention to?
The use case conversation is difficult. Much has been said, oh, don't worry about it. Most of the bad things that you can do with Gen AI are already regulated and illegal, so nothing new. But I do think that there are entire categories of work products that we need to go think through. What does that mean?
Do you not think there's like an inherent challenge just in terms of the opacity of models? Like when we think about the regulatory challenges, we can't continue to have such opacity to get to outcomes. Will there not need to be more transparency in models to show people the pathway to answers?
So 100%. Two examples. One, again, from last week, IBM was announcing their own Gen AI models, and they were talking about being fully transparent on the data that went into the models. That's a big step in lineage. The other one is talking about how they trained it. So they're in tune with this concern, and they want to surface it in a more open way. The other example is at Snowflake, we acquired this company, Neeva, that was doing consumer search based or augmented by LLMs. And a lot of the principles that they had when they created this product was you want to have citations and quotations and attribution, even if it's a summary, every snippet, what was the source that it came from, which is a way to control for hallucination. So I would say that is the world that we're headed towards, at least in the enterprise. Like, forget the creative side of things, but at least in the world where you need correct answers, you need to be able to attribute where things came from.
I totally agree with you in terms of that attribution. I also was one of Shrital's first investors with Neeva. So that was great to hear. Can I ask you that, obviously Snowflake is an incumbent. You've mentioned IBM there last week. We've mentioned also OpenAI and Anthropic, which I don't know which camp you put them in, startup or incumbent, probably incumbent now, given funding amounts. How do you think about the question of where does value accrue in this next decade of AI? Is it the startups building, or is it the incumbents who have the distribution?
I would bias towards incumbents that have the data. So I would say, think of all the data that a company like Google has, or that's public data, or no, semi-public, but a lot of user data, or think all the private enterprise data that a company like Snowflake has. And that's obviously a self-serving comment. But I do think that data is what powers outcomes. And I think those are going to be the companies that at least are best positioned. But to make things harder is, I think all of the folks that have data are creating platforms for startups and others to come and leverage that data and deliver innovation. So it's complicated, but I would bias towards the incumbents.
Yeah, listen, I have to say I do agree with you. I also don't think you can underestimate, especially in the short term, the power of distribution. And I think like the co-pilot strategy is like a very incumbent focused strategy, which will win in the next 2 to 3 years for sure. But I'm a VC, so we pontificate on stuff we don't know about, Christian, but you'll learn more about that, as you know. Can I ask, the other question that comes up is open versus closed. We mentioned opacity, we mentioned transparency. How do you think about whether closed systems versus open systems will be more dominant in the next 10 years as the predominant way to build the best models?
Yeah, I think there's nuance on what open means. Usually it refers to the weights of a model are available. That's sort of the bright line. But beyond that, there are questions on, are there use case restrictions? For example, Llama 2 is very significant as a development in the industry, but they were very clear, thou shall not use Llama 2 for training other models. Thou shall not use Llama 2 for, I think it's 700 million user use cases. You can say, is that fully open or not? And sure, because the weights are available, you can say it meets the bright line definition. But there are other items that define what is more or less open. I do think that open weights creates a lot of opportunity for research and further innovation. Much has been said of how much excitement and interest is happening around the open model. So from that perspective, I think there's a lot of value of those models. But I also think that commercial solutions will largely be hosted cloud services, in which case, in the same way that it is true with open source, I think it'll be true about open weights. I have no idea if it matters or not. At the end of the day, is who has the best answers or the best service integrated for customers.
I totally agree with you in terms of who has the best service there. Can I ask one final one that I am thinking about a lot, which is just like speed of adoption. Everyone seems very worried about, impact on jobs, impact on economies that AI brings. Are you concerned by the speed of adoption? I guess, how should businesses prepare for the shockwave of AI?
All of this is harder than people realize. The demos are awesome. The productization takes longer time. So I would say all of us should go forward as fast as we can, because there's going to be natural difficulties that will just throttle us. I also, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think that it's a mass firings happening next week. It's more hopefully incremental productivity boosts happening over the next 6, 12, 24 months. And then over time, you decide whether you take those productivity gains and you turn them into fewer employees versus more productively deployed employees.
Can I ask you a hard question? How does AI change a business like Snowflake? You have a very large existing line of business, which generates great revenue and is your core, but then you have a very exciting new frontier and platform shift, or underlying technology, whatever we want to call it, that could power the next decade of revenue. How do you think about balancing the maintenance and healthcare of existing revenue with the attention required to innovate on the new platform shift?
For us, it was very aligned with what we've been doing strategically. The story of Snowflake is all about eliminating silos for companies so they can reason across their data holistically. And a big part of eliminating silos was, how do we bring the computation to the data as opposed to copy data all over the place, which is why Snowflake for the last 2, almost 3 years has been evolving towards a broader application platform. And from that perspective, Gen AI and LLMs are just a new form of application. And in the same way that we wanted to be able to host, traditional ML or traditional data engineering tasks, we are doing the work to bring Gen AI and LLMs to the data. I think at the end of the day, it's a tailwind based primarily on my comment earlier that I think that the centers of gravity will be where the data resides. And from that perspective, many customers have entrusted us with their data.
I take the opportunity when I can to ask questions to experts like you. And so I do want to do this. You're a product OG, Christian, and you wouldn't say it, so I can. I think that with AI, you see the reducing value of UI. You will see personalization and customization according to each user. And actually, you see this kind of chasm between device and user in a way that wasn't before. Do you agree that UI importance will reduce with the increasing prominence of AI?
I would say that for certain use cases, that's entirely true. Like if I have a UI to, configure a cluster, I don't need to know all the options. I just can specify what I want. There are many use cases where you may want a richer way to interact with data or with whatever is the problem space that I don't think Gen AI would dramatically change it. It does continue to help with personalization, and we've been on the journey of personalization for a long time. So I would say, yes, some use cases, it shifts the value of UI, but many others has the opportunity to continue to enrich them.
I totally get you. Can I ask, what do you think Snowflake's biggest challenge is in terms of embracing and getting your arms around this next wave of iteration around AI? I know it's a continuation given the data first strategy and mindset, but if there was a challenge or an internal, hey, we're going to solve this, or how are we going to get around this? What do you think that is?
Probably perception. I talk to folks on a regular basis, and many of them still think of us as data warehousing. We moved on from those origins, 6 years ago, and move on is not the right word. We expanded from those origins 6 years ago, but I think we need to make sure that organizations across the world understand that they can do AI and Gen AI close to the data within Snowflake without having to copy the data to a different platform.
Why don't they already?
When you're very successful with some positioning, that comes and bites you later, that you are too successful with that positioning. And for many years, we said Snowflake is the data warehouse built for the cloud. And that still keeps getting repeated over and over. And it's a journey. If you think about most companies end up stuck with their original use case for a long time, we see a little bit of that here.
Kaz, one final one before we move into a quick fire. I've so enjoyed this, but when we think about your leadership style as the product leader that you are today, how do you think your style of product leadership has changed over the years?
I've been more willing to push opinions in a slightly more top-down way as more time has gone by. Earlier on, it was, I need to be a great manager and listen to everyone and accommodate everyone's opinion. And I'm not trying to say that's not important, but in some instances where you want a product to come out with a consistent view, as if it came from a single unified set of principles and individuals, sometimes you have to go and push for something like, hey, this is what we're doing. I think that confidence comes or evolves over time.
A really hard one that's just a subsequent one from that. I had Gustav, who's the CPO at Spotify, on the show, and he says, talk is cheap, so we should do more of it. How do you think about the balance between internal debate on product and product ideas, iterations, versus just speed of execution and getting it done?
I think it depends on the nature of the technology or the nature of the product. At Snowflake, we have both types of technology. So the core subsystem that does, say, clustering of data on disk, I think you want to design that thing really, really well, measure 100 times and cut once, because nobody wants their data to get corrupted or their results to be wrong if that thing is not built the right way. But if you want the UI for a query editor and you have 10 different ways on how you could do suggestions for customers, there's no right and wrong. Might as well go quickly, iterate, learn from users. So I would say both are the right tools and the right approaches depending on what you're trying to do.
Listen, I could spend all day chatting to you. I want to move into a quick fire round. So I say a short statement, you give me your immediate thoughts. Does that sound okay?
Sounds good.
Okay, so what do others not know that you know to be true?
I don't know if others don't know, but I for sure know that it always comes down to people.
In terms of hiring, in terms of customers?
Everything, the results, the relationships, how things are going, everything is just people.
Can one succeed as a PM today without being deeply technical?
For the most part, no. There may be a few types of products that you might get by, but I like deep technical PMs.
What's your biggest piece of advice to a PM starting a new role today?
Learn the product that you're a PM of. Go be a user. Go as deep as you can know the technology.
Do all founders need to be in the Valley who are innovating in AI?
Absolutely not.
What makes you say that?
Well, there's amazing talent throughout the world. And even though the Valley has something special from the community and the ability to bounce ideas of one another, it's very clear right now there's a lot of innovation happening elsewhere.
What's the best product decision you've made, and how did you learn from it?
Focusing Snowflake on ease of use.
What did you learn from that? Focus and ease of use.
It is something a little bit counterintuitive that you may put out a product faster to the market if you just say, I don't know if we should be used this way or that way, so you just surface choices to users. And sometimes it takes longer for us to take the automatic choice and simplify for customers. So it may be counterintuitive that faster is not necessarily better if simpler is what is being traded off.
What's the single biggest element that you'd most like to change about the AI community?
I will double down on they need to know that Snowflake is a great platform for AI.
Listen, always be selling, baby. Tell me, Quentin Clark said, were you right about Satya in the beginning?
I was super wrong. When Satya came into the enterprise business, this is before he was CEO, he came in very short order, made a lot of really difficult decisions. How the org was structured, how contractors were hired, how we thought about the cloud versus the on-premises products. And at the time, my thinking was like, I don't think that he understands all of this. And obviously with the benefit of hindsight, or actually shortly after, it was very clear he understood it better than all of us. And he's proven to be a brilliant leader.
What do you think makes Satya such a brilliant leader?
He is very clear on what the needed outcome or desired outcome is. So he's a clear thinker would be the attribute. And then he can relentlessly drive towards it and not get encumbered by all the 100 reasons that we all make up for ourselves.
I love Frank Slootman, okay? I love him because he's no bullshit. He says how it is in a world where no leader says how it is. What have been your biggest lessons from working with Frank?
He is also such a clear thinker. He has that commonality with Satya, that he becomes a clarifying force. Oftentimes, if you're just picturing yourself telling Frank about a problem and a couple of options, just in the formulation, it becomes very obvious that you don't even need to get his opinion because you know where he's going to stand. So that type of clarity that he has simplifies decision-making, accelerates decision-making. He's also an amazing, amazing leader.
I love that. And I always love his emphasis on focus. I think it's the most important lesson I've learned from him. Final one for you, my friend. Next 10 years, what role does AI play in society then?
Productivity boost on pretty much everything we do. Everything is going to be simpler, easier, faster.
What impact does that have on GDP? Is it like 2%? Is it like 10%?
Well, I don't know the magnitude, but for sure, net positive.
Should we have a bet?
Sounds good to me.
What do you want to bet on? Would you do 10 or 2?
2.
Yeah, I would too. Yeah. Bugger. Well, listen, I'll buy you dinner in London next time you're here to thank you for this anyway.
Sounds wonderful.
Christian, this has been fantastic. You are a star. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Harry, thank you for having me. It's been fun chatting with you.